I was raised in Howell, Michigan. We moved there when I was 6 years old. It was my mom and dad and 5 kids, 2 older brothers, an older sister, and younger sister, and me. We were just like every other family. No weirdness, but our house? That was a different story. We never stayed in a house for too long. My folks would buy an old rundown house and renovate it for resale. In a way, it sucked because with 5 kids, you couldn't afford 2 houses, plus the money to fix one up. Basically, we always lived in the houses Dad was renovating. There was always a lot of improvising when you live in a home being renovated, although it did teach us how to make do with what we had. The house they bought in Howell was an 1800s farmhouse. Over the years, people had tried to make it a home, but it needed a lot. As I said, I was young when we moved in. It took Dad about 4 years to get that crappy old house into something a person or family could be proud of. While we were there, some pretty strange things happened. We would live in the house for about a month. Keep in mind, with 5 kids, there's a lot of commotion. I'm sure things were happening, but we were too busy to see it. As the new home became more familiar, all us kids started noticing our stuff being moved. Loud banging noises were always blamed on the kid that was standing closest to where it came from, even if they denied doing it. It took about a year before things started to go haywire. Dad was building a dormer off the back of the house. Oh, sorry, that's just a fancy word for an addition. He wanted to make a larger upstairs by adding 2 more bedrooms and a bathroom. While cutting into the roof/attic, he found a little room that no one knew was there. It looked like a child's room. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even finished. The walls were wall studs and plank board that looked like it had seen a lot of rain. The floor was also old plank board with large gaps between the boards. If you have ever stood in a very old barn where you can see daylight coming through the walls, that's what it was like. Over in the corner was a small bed. Maybe an animal was living in there because the blankets looked like old burlap, and there was old dried up feces all over the floor. A pile of very, very old baby toys were next to the bed. I saw a pulley hanging from the ceiling. An old rotted piece of rope looped through the pulley and tied to an old rusty bucket on the floor. The other end went through a hole in the floor. My sister said they put food in the bucket and pulled it up to the kid they kept in the attic. At the time, I was too young to understand. As I got older, I began having dreams about the child in the small room. The hole in the floor was just big enough to climb through. There were no other doors. Later, we found the hole was in the ceiling of a small closet downstairs. The entire closet looked like it had been boarded up many years earlier. Dad told us that in the old days, sometimes Mom and Dad's had more kids than bedrooms. Sometimes they did things like this. I asked why the kid couldn't go downstairs to use the bathroom. He told us he would handle it and not to worry about it. Soon my dad had a staircase, 2 bedrooms, and a big bathroom upstairs. There were already 3 bedrooms downstairs. Mom and Dad crammed us all in them until the upstairs was done. Dad worked nonstop until each of us had our own space. That was the first renovation on the house. The upstairs was beautiful. I thought, if the rest of the house looked this good, why would you ever leave? Me and my brother and my 2 sisters got the new bedrooms. The house was quiet until my brother and I moved into our room. It's probably worth mentioning our room was built where we found the child's bed and all the baby toys. Obviously, there was no way to tell it was ever there, but my reoccurring dreams kept it fresh in my mind. Most of the activity happened in my room. Often, I would wake up, make my bed, eat, and go to school. When I came home, I was immediately yelled at for not making my bed. I knew I had, but when I got to my bedroom, my pillow and all the blankets were on the floor at the foot of the bed. I figured my sister was just trying to get me in trouble, so I told myself I would get even with her later. That night, I had the reoccurring dream of the kid in the attic. The dream was always cloudy. I was always standing in the distance, watching. But this time, I was right there. I could see everything. At first, I was in the attic. I was crouched down. The low pitch of the roof was right above my head. The stench of urine and feces attacked my senses. A small, unclothed child scurried around the small area on all fours. It was covered in filth and its own feces. It moved like an animal being kept in a cage. It hopped up and down, never changing to the upright position like a normal child. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl. Its hair was long and ungroomed. Finally, it turned enough to reveal it was a boy. He frantically hopped up and down, grunting and growling. I heard a man's voice yelling. I could see through the hole to the downstairs. It all seemed so real. I just kept telling myself, this is only a dream. It's not real. I could see an angry bald man with a handlebar mustache and no shirt standing in the closet below. He smacked a broom handle from one side of the hole to the other. It made a loud crack that startled me, but his voice scared me. He called the child an animal and said if he didn't stop, he wouldn't get food. Then the bald man extended his reach and tried to hit the child with the broom handle. With lightning reflexes, the boy jumped to the left and dodged the attack. The way the boy reacted, it seemed like this was a normal occurrence. The boy showed his teeth and growled at the man. On all fours, he leaped to his bed and curled up like a dog. He rubbed his stomach and began to cry. I wanted to try to comfort him, but I couldn't move. I whispered, "Hey, it's okay. I'll try to help you." Just then, his eyes opened and his head turned and looked right at me. I said again, "It's only a dream." He looked confused. On all fours, he crawled to where I was and stared at me. I asked his name, but he said nothing. I extended my hand, and just as I was about to touch him, I found myself standing in the kitchen, scooping animal intestines into a bucket. The bald man was behind me when he said that was enough, and that it didn't deserve to be fed. He grabbed my shoulder and led me to the closet. He tied the bucket to the rope and hoisted up toward the hole. It missed the center of the hole, making a loud bang. The bucket swung side to side. Blood and intestines spilled onto the closet floor and the bald man's face and shoulders. As the bucket began to drop, a small arm reached through the hole and pulled it. I disappeared into the dark. The man screamed that he was going to kill the boy. With the turn of my head, he was gone. I could hear his footsteps in the kitchen. The sound of drawers slamming scared me. Above, I could hear the bucket being pushed across the floor of the attic. The boy's animal-like behavior told me he was probably feeding from the bucket, the same way a dog would feed from his dog bowl. I heard my name being called. I opened my eyes, and the dream was over. My brother stood over my bed, telling me to get up. It was time for breakfast. As I laid in my bed, the same spot the boy's bed used to be, I couldn't help but feel sad. Did the man kill him? Was the boy put into a hospital, or was the child buried somewhere on the surrounding property? I sat up and looked across the room. My brother was already downstairs eating. Suddenly, the curtains on my window opened. No one there to open them. They just opened. I jumped up from my bed, grabbed my clothes, and raced downstairs. Everyone was at the breakfast table. As I stood in the center of the kitchen, the image of me filling the bucket raced through my mind. Quickly, my trance was broken by the laughter of my siblings. "You gonna wear those clothes, or are you just gonna carry them around school all day?" The laughter got louder as my mother shuffled me into the living room. She kissed me on my head and said, "Maybe tomorrow you can get dressed in your bedroom." She smiled and went back into the kitchen. As I started to put my clothes on, I felt something brush into me from behind. Expecting to see one of my brothers behind me, I yelled, "Leave me alone!" I pulled my pants to my waist and turned around to confront my antagonizer. There was no one there. I looked around the entire room, thinking maybe he tucked behind a piece of furniture. I felt another brush against my arm. This time I wasn't bent over. The touch was hard enough to move my arm, but it didn't hurt. Suddenly, you could hear the sound of bare feet running in circles around me on the hard wood floor. I felt a brush against my leg, similar to the way a dog or cat brushes into you or when it wants your attention. I wasn't scared, I just couldn't figure out what was going on. Calmly, I turned and went into the kitchen. I finished dressing at the breakfast table. Mom gave me some cereal and the pitcher of milk. My younger sister returned to the teasing used to torment me earlier. "Are you gonna forget to brush your teeth too, stupid?" She was young, and I knew she was just trying to be like the older siblings, so I didn't even acknowledge her. Just then her chair fell backward. She hit the floor with a loud bang. My mother raced to her aid. She helped her to her feet and began checking her for injuries. My father quickly told her not to lean back in her chair. When all four legs are on the floor, you don't fall backwards. He immediately returned to his newspaper. Mom's voice became stern when she told him his negative tone wasn't welcome at the breakfast table. He never looked up, he just kept quiet. Mom continued to pamper my sister and nicely told her not to lean back in her chair. That's when my sister said she wasn't leaning back. She got pushed. Dad lowered his paper and looked at Mom. Mom calmly said, "Honey, you were all by yourself at the end of the table. No one could have pushed you." My little sister became infuriated. In a louder voice, she demanded that she was pushed. My older brother shook his head and told her, "Fine, you were pushed. Can we eat breakfast now?" The rest of breakfast was quiet. Afterward, we all went to school and followed our normal routines. When I got home, I was doing my chores. My older brother was up in the old barn. The loft was full of useless junk left behind by the previous owners. Dad parked a trailer next to a big hay pile inside the barn. My brother had to carry the junk down the ladder and put it on the trailer so Dad could haul it away. It was hot that day and even hotter up in the loft. I could tell my brother was getting tired of the trips up and down the ladder. Soon he began throwing stuff from the loft. It landed in and around the trailer below. Larger items like furniture and loaded boxes crashed to the barn floor like they were dropped from an airplane. I warned him that Dad wouldn't want him doing that. He yelled at me to mind my own business and then threw a small box down at me. It hit the ground near my feet, and colorful pieces of wood and plastic exploded in all directions. I stared at the ground trying to figure out what was in the box. The small, colorful but faded fragments riddled the floor. I reached down and opened a flap on the crushed box. It was full of old baby toys. My brother, clearly still angry, told me to clean up the mess or he was gonna... I was staring right at him when I watched his head jerk backwards. His chest pushed out and his body lunged forward. It was like something shoved him. He tried to regain his balance, but he couldn't. He fell from the loft. It felt like slow motion watching him fall to the barn floor. He landed partially on the hay pile. Unfortunately, his left leg hit first. The doctor said it sent direct trauma to his lower spine. My older brother was confined to a wheelchair. He underwent a series of surgeries. The doctors said they were hopeful that with time and more surgeries, one day he might be able to walk again. After the fall, I ran to his side. He was just lying there looking at me. I honestly didn't think he was hurt. His only words were, "Get help." As I stood up, I could hear something coming from the loft. It sounded like something running in circles. Suddenly, it stopped. Then it began to jump up and down. I could see the dust falling from the loft above me. I wasted no time. I ran to the house. Dad was working nearby. We raced to the barn. In moments, the yard was filled with police and EMS. My parents went to the hospital with my brother. My other brother was left to watch us kids. The house was creepishly quiet. I decided to go down to the barn despite my father's strict warning to stay out of there. I stood on the barn floor, reliving in my mind what I saw. I decided I had to climb up into the loft. When I reached the top of the ladder, that's when I saw it. The loft floor had circular patterns where there once was thick dust. One of the circles swept right behind where my brother stood before he fell. Every circle seemed to be made of small hand and footprints, each handprint just in front of a footprint. Instantly, I was reminded of the boy in my dreams and the way he moved about the attic on all fours. The circles were not nearly as disturbing as seeing the baby toys that earlier covered the barn floor back in their box sitting where my brother last stood near the edge of the loft. That's when I realized the boy in my dreams and the connection I made with him was real. Up until now, I kept trying to rationalize the incident in the kitchen with my sister falling back in her chair, the ramp circling in the living room around me, and even my bed being unmade after I left the room. I struggled with the thought of telling my parents. It was all so unbelievable. Then, one night, I was in my bed. I could hear my mom and dad talking in the hall outside my door. Dad told Mom he had had a bad feeling about the house since the day he started cutting into the roof to build the new upstairs. He said tools kept disappearing. His ladder almost fell over twice while he was standing on it. His voice got stern. Then I heard him say, "It was like someone pushed it." I heard Mom gasp. Then in a nervous voice, she asked what they should do. My father replied that they would put the house up for sale that day. The improvements he had made already increased the value of the house. My mother sounded relieved. He said he found another house. Then he said the barn was the last straw. My parents' voices faded as they headed downstairs. After that, things pretty much went like you would think. The second couple that looked at the house offered full price. They said they had a feeling about it, like the house was choosing them. They just had to have it. Then they told my mom and dad that they were mediums. I didn't know what that was. I was just a little kid. Mom told me they were people who try to help spirits, and some can even speak to spirits. I knew then that they would be able to help the boy's soul move on. The nice people bought the house and we moved to another fixer-upper. Dad fixed that one and we sold it and moved to another one. This went on for years. We never talked about the old farmhouse. We just put it behind us. My brother had 2 more surgeries. He now has full use of his legs. To this day, he still doesn't remember the fall. I, on the other hand, watched the whole thing. I often have the dream about the boy in the attic. I know we connected to each other in that dream. Often, I dream about the day in the barn. I watch the boy on all fours running like a dog in his circular patterns right before he pushes my brother from the loft. Something inside me thinks the boy didn't understand, like he thought he was protecting me. Our connection makes me want to go to the old farmhouse to see if he's finally at rest. Then I think, what if he follows me home? Maybe I could make him understand. What would you do?